Welcome back. Today we're going to talk about our Linq to SQL generator. The Linq to SQL generator is our version of a lightweight framework wrapped around the Linq to SQL technology developed by Microsoft. It can be considered a partner to the SQL generator. The Linq to SQL generator binds stored procedures to a C# data class, generates all of the intermediaries, including POCOs, and then publishes this to a directory that you'd like to emit the code to. To get started, make sure that your data connection is pointing to the environment that you wish to bind. The second step is to make sure that your configuration connection is pointed to somewhere that stores the templates for the Linq generator. Opening the Linq generator, we see a series of scripts. Now these scripts are templates which are used to generate the different data classes and lightweight POCOs that are used when executing the data class. Now in our SQL Generator video, we talked about the concept of namespaces. If you haven't watched that video, go back and watch that video, then come here and continue with this video. Namespaces are an important concept in how we divide up data schema and import it into our system. Additionally, the reason we're using Linq to SQL rather than in Hibernate or Entity Framework or some other data tier is because we didn't want to pick winners and losers in that, and because we think that a lightweight system is the best way to go. Stored procedures add in a layer of abstraction that lets you have a consistent data model and data interaction when you start looking at say Cosmo or table storage or any of the other storage mechanisms in this PaaS environment. You'll notice that they're using a link to something methodology. And because they're using Linq to say XML or JSON and link queries and table storage, we felt that SQL should be no different than any of the other data storage types, not some special framework that only applied to this data layer. Secondly, by doing this, you can swap out your data layers or your storage targets without really disrupting the business code. Now, Linq to SQL also represents the complete rewrite of the Microsoft SQL Metal engine. We've taken that engine and what it emits, and we've stripped out all the unnecessarily complex pieces and put in a much more lightweight, robust engine. So this DBML generator will actually run a lot faster and validate much quicker than the one built into Visual Studio. Now, all that being said, it's completely up to you if you want to use this. AzStudio's built-in projects will use this technology when it's using their internal APIs. But if you want to build your project on top of Entity Framework in Hibernate, ADO.NET, it doesn't matter. You can go ahead and do so, and it won't disturb us in the least. But we're going to go through how we bind and execute SQL on our system. The first thing to look at is the script. Now, the script is a JSON object, so we have this nice handy-dandy button to let you set one up. The things to remember are you got a class name, a namespace, a matching substring, which is this is telling the Linq generator only stored procedures which have this substring or matching string in the store procedure name are going to be picked up by this particular script. A method prefix, this is when we generate the different data classes. We're going to want a prefix on there so that they stay uniquely named. An output name, we'll talk about repo root in just a minute. And then a template source name, which is, generate simple DBML class is simple. You can substitute your own template and emit different kinds of code pretty easily. Let's talk about exclusion strings really quickly. Exclusion strings are used when you have a more general, and I'm looking for this now, you have a more general pattern to one of your data classes, but you don't want it picking up other strings. For instance, this method prefix is saying AzStudio, which is pretty much all the stored procedures in that we generate. However, we'd like it to ignore certain domains of stored procedure names because we're going to put those in other data classes, or at least other C# files. And so therefore we got an exclusion strings. What that means is if the stored procedure has this name, this string in its name, then and it doesn't have one of these in its name as well, then please pick it up and include it in the generation of the data class. Now, since these data class generators don't really know where your projects are, and they're not really project oriented, they're more code template oriented, it needs to know where the repo root is locally on your system. So you can change this. As you can see, C Monza Cloud repos is where I keep my repos when I pull them down out of Git. Yours can change. These paths that we show you here are going to be relative to that repo root, and it changes for every user. So don't forget to change your repo root, or this data class code may not emit into your project correctly. Once you've set up the script, which is pretty easy, and you've set up what you want for your masking to be for the different templates, all you have to do is click Generate. And this will go out and pick up all the code, or all the stored procedures on the SQL server that you've pointed to with your data connection. Okay, data is going to connect to our demo dev environment, and then it's going to generate some Linq. Once the operation is complete, your stored procedures have been turned into data class methods and into POCOs, and have already been tested to make sure there's no SQL errors in them. This has all been emitted to a C# file somewhere in your project. On your project, you'll have to include it. If it's already included, it'll simply be updated. Now, once the data class is in your system, it can be referenced. And as you can see, we've got some pretty clean code for actually accessing it. Let's see what we can find for our data row modified. So essentially, this is a plugin that's only going to connect to the config database, and it's going to use the AzStudio data context, and it's going to use this extension. As you can see, we just pass in an arguments class, and the arguments class takes in the different the different properties that an arguments class needs. All of the CRUD that was generated in SQL Generator, and we come with quite a bit out of the box: delete, update, or insert, or upsert in some cases. Select by column name, select by primary key, select by foreign key. All of this is already built for you, and it's pretty easy to deal with. So the Linq to SQL layer, which is normally generated in a Linq to SQL connection through Entity Framework or some other process, the DBML generator that comes with Visual Studio, doesn't have one of these arguments class. And the reason we do this is to sort of use Linq, but emulate Entity Framework in a way, which is we're still dealing with POCOs, and we still have the ability to move data in and out of visual controls and out of POCO, our objects, so that the clean object model that's in these different frameworks is now implemented in the Linq framework, without all the overhead of all these CLR operations or schema being in the code, or any of that. Basically, schema has already been determined, the code has been bound to the schema, and now you're going to do your operations. And the way we bind that is through POCOs. Basically, pretty easy to deal with. All right, so this class is going to be whatever you named it in the script that you ran in Linq to SQL. This is the ID of the form that that's wanting access to that particular connection, and this is the connection type config. There are 3 connection types in AzStudio out of the box. One is config, One is current, which is picking up on what the user has selected and pointed to current. And the last one is lookup. And lookup takes a couple of extra parameters, which is a business object name and a shard name. If you want to use business object name and a shard name and your lookup type, then you're going to have to map out the client rights in the editors in order to be allowed to connect to that system. Most of the time, connection context types current is most likely going to be the one you want. However, if you're working with more than one database, you're going to want to use lookup. So let's talk a little bit about how we configure a lookup so that it works correctly. When we're using the type lookup, what we're actually saying is we have a client, and that client's name is X, usually a business object name, and it wants to connect to a named environment, a named shard in the system. In which case, you have to do a few things. First, you have to create the client service. In this case, we only have one out of the box, which is AzStudio Business Objects. The second thing is you have to map the rights to it. In other words, if you want it to have access to a particular data source, you have to create a connection label for that data source. Once you've done those two things, the system will be allowed to connect to that shard and segment, or database and shard that you've defined. Database shards being defined here and mapped through the, where is it mapped? One second. Not there. Here. And they're mapped here. So if you wanted to add a second or third database that you want to connect to, you create that shard name here and you map it into your client rights. Once you've done that, you can connect to it. You can then give right to that business object to connect to that shard, and then everything will work fine in your code. Because shard names can be anything and they're mapped to a connection string, the connection string can then use SQL security to connect to a database server using a different alias or a different username with restricted rights, or access only to certain data members in that database. By mapping that to a business object name, the programmer is abstracted away from the SQL security and the connection string, and only has to deal with, okay, well, I'm in the restricted shard, and my business object name is foo, and so foo can only get to the restricted shard. It can't get to the main one. It can't get to anything. So by using those aliases, you've locked down your programmer in Linq to the database segment or the database piece you want to see. Also, shards can point to different physical databases through the connection string, which again gives you this ability for only certain business objects to talk to certain SQL instances. Now, the best way to get some experience with this is to take our plugin training, which is available online. That's going to take you into a great amount of detail about read, write, and query operations inside our Linq adapter, and explains data classes in a little bit more detail than we have here. Again, you don't have to use this, but we find it's fast, it's lightweight, and really helps out with a lot of different scenarios that your business may or may not encounter. Thanks for watching.